Good evening, all of you, and a very warm welcome on behalf of the HL College of Commerce, the Ahmedabad Education Society, and the HL College Alumni Association. I take this privilege in welcoming all of you to this year's Principal S.V. Desai Memorial Lecture. As we all know, this is one of those events of the year that we all eagerly look forward to. Not just because it celebrates a career of one of the most iconic educationists of his time, Principal S.V. Desai Sahab, but also because of the kind of speakers it attracts. And I'm very happy to say that, well, we've had range of distinguished speakers to take forward that legacy. We have someone who's equally eminent and accomplished in Shri Sanjeev Sanyal. Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a loud round of applause for our speaker of the day? And before I take my seat, I just want to say that every year this lecture is very special to all of us, sir. But today it means all the more for two very different reasons. One, because after a long time, I think after at least 5 to 6 years, we have an economist, a trained economist, delivering this lecture. S.V. Desai Sahab also used to teach economics. So in a lot of ways, this is certainly a very befitting occasion that you could make it to be here with us. And also, I was taking a small note with Principal Ma'am and Pathak Sahab in the coffee area that he must be one of the youngest ever speakers to be delivering this year's S.V. Desai Memorial Lecture.
I request you, sir, to please grace the dais with your presence. I welcome you on the dais, and I request Shri B.M. Shah, the director of the Ahmedabad Education Society, to please welcome him with flowers on behalf of all of us present here. A loud round of applause once more. Welcome, sir, to the prestigious lecture. Shri Sanyal believes that every generation needs to rethink and question the paradigms on which a society and its economy are based. This is his mission in life, and we look forward to an intellectually stimulating experience this evening as he speaks about and presents his views on rethinking India's economy for the 21st century. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Principal, past principals, faculty, alumni, current students of HL College, and of course, members of the Desai family. It is indeed an honor and privilege to be able to deliver the S.V. Desai Memorial Lecture. Given the long list of those who have delivered the lecture before me, I am really hoping that this will not be remembered as the low point of this series. I have been asked to speak about rethinking the Indian economy for the 21st century. And many of you may be now perhaps expecting me to give a lecture on, new technologies like artificial intelligence or new genetic sciences, or about the implications of China's rise and India's place in the world. But as you will see, there are great difficulties when you are looking at long periods of time. And since we are still in 2020, we still have 80 years left of the 21st century. So when we are dealing with long periods of time, there are great dangers of extrapolating current trends into the future. And therefore, I have to be very, very careful about what really I talk about. So in order to explain what I mean, let me tell you a little story. And the story gives you a sense, just like we are in the beginning of the 21st century, looking out towards the rest of the century. Let's go back to the end of the 19th century and look at how the people then used to think about the 20th century. Now, it was in 1898 that the first global urban planning conference was held in New York. So the most eminent urban thinkers of that time came from all over the world, and they came to New York to discuss the most urgent urban issue of the time, which was the issue of horse dung. And after 3 days of thinking about this issue, they heard out various experts on this issue, and of course the British were there, and the British experts were of the opinion that in 50 years, which is the middle of the 20th century, if things had not really been corrected, then London would find itself 9 feet deep in horse dung. But of course, as you know, within 15 years, this problem had completely disappeared. In fact, by the time the First World War came around, the 1 lakh plus horses of New York had been, to a very large extent, been replaced by automobiles. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story is for 2 things. First of all, to demonstrate to you the dangers of extrapolating our current thoughts and ideas, which may be useful for relatively short duration, over a longer duration. This is a particular danger with economists. It's an even bigger danger with management consultants and PowerPoint presentations. And it's a really, really big danger when you hand out researchers with an Excel sheet. The reason for this is that, of course, the world we live in is a very, very complicated place. We are not only buffeted by new technologies, but by new socioeconomic changes, geopolitics, and all of these things, of course, interact with each other in completely unknowable ways. There are butterfly effects, there are unintended consequences, there is politics. All of this means that the future is fundamentally unknowable. And so the biggest danger really is to pretend to know what is going to happen. And in fact, perhaps the greatest 20th century economist, Friedrich Hayek, in his Nobel acceptance speech, mocked other economists by giving a speech on the pretense of knowledge. I encourage all of you to read this speech. It's his Nobel acceptance speech. And effectively, he demolishes his own chosen field. So that, therefore, what can we do about the future? So one of the things you need to do about the future is to think about principles, second-order principles, that have been useful over very long periods of time. And I will come to this later in my talk. But before that, let me take you to a second thing that comes out of my story about the first Global Urban Conference, and which is this, that the intellectual frame of reference determines to a very large extent the conclusions you arrive at. Now, many people may think that they are arriving to the conclusions they have arrived at by virtue of data or logical thinking and so on. But in fact, to a very large extent, the conclusions you derive are determined merely by the frame of reference that you have chosen. So if the frame of reference you have chosen is horses, then I'm afraid it's very, very likely you will end up discussing horse dung. Now, why is this important? This is important because although we spent something like 40 years trying to implement various kinds of utopian socialist policies, which clearly failed, not just in India, but worldwide. Although we are now 3 decades after we started liberalizing our economy from 1991, it remains the case that much of the policy making we do, the discussions we have in the media, much of the academic literature, etc., is still defined by a certain intellectual framework, which means that the default that we always fall back on tends to be some form of state intervention. We still truly at the back of our heads believe in a Mai Baap Sarkar. Why is that the case? This is the case because although in 1991 we decided to liberalize our economy and go in for reforms, we did not do it because we had changed our frame of reference. We did it because we were in a crisis and we did not have a choice. And because we did not bother to change this frame of reference, we have remained ever since very reluctant reformers. We reform, but we are very apologetic about it. We will privatize, but we will use an euphemism, disinvestment. And I work in the government, so let me tell you, if we are actively pushing for reforms, we'll get some of them. But if we are not really looking actively, then the default option of the bureaucracy is some sort of government intervention in the market. The assumption somewhere at the back of your mind is that markets fundamentally do not function, that there is continuous market failure. But on the other hand, there is almost no discussion about state failure. Why is that the case? That is the case because the intellectual frame of reference that we still have imbibed and continue to perpetuate is still from the lineage that goes back to Harold Lasky and Joan Robinson and Mahalanobis and Amartya Sen and all the way down to today, Abhijit Banerjee. That is the only lineage of thought that you are likely to be exposed in your universities. I have not looked at HL College's curriculum, but I would be rather surprised if it is not heavily dominated by this lineage of thought. We are almost never exposed to other frameworks of thinking about the world. And this means that ultimately this is what the intellectuals, leaders, and other policymakers in our system essentially create as their default. I know this for a fact, that this is what is essentially taught to our bureaucrats when they study in Missouri. So this is the issue that I am going to now deal with, which is, are there other frameworks of thinking that we can bring to bear when we think about India's economy in the 21st century? So I'll talk about a few frames of reference. There are many frames of reference, and I always think that one shouldn't think about the world in any one particular frame of reference. A plurality of frames of reference is very, very important. Incidentally, a very Hindu way of thinking about the world. So one frame of reference that we can use, perhaps, is the East Asian miracle. Why? Because, you see, the Amartya Sen lineage of thinking basically has at the back of its mind the following idea, which is that India is a poor country, we will remain a poor country, and there is no point in aspiring to be anything other than a poor country, which means that the best we can do really is some sort of a government scheme in order to redistribute poverty. And if we are really good at it and we use all the correct RCT studies, then those schemes will be better at making the poor a little bit better. It is assumed simply in there that there is no question of a poor country becoming rich. And yet, the East Asian miracle clearly shows that you can have country after country, some large, some small, with different kinds of political ideologies, can make themselves wealthier in very short period of time. And so, if you look at the previous economic survey, we extensively talked about it, about the East Asian miracle, the export and investment-driven growth model that these countries use to become richer within a very short period of time, leveraging the demographic dividend that they were enjoying at that time, and we are just about to enjoy over the next 30 years. So this was clearly something we should need to think about. But do we get taught Lee Kuan Yew's ideas? No. Instead, we are much more likely to be taught about the ideas of Karl Marx. Now, whenever I ask people, why don't you teach Lee Kuan Yew's ideas? He'll say, oh, but because Singapore is a very small country, it's not applicable in India. But the same person will never be able to tell me which economy in the world has become more prosperous as a result of Karl Marx. Talking of Karl Marx, there are other frames of reference that we can think of from the West, other than Karl Marx. Because after all, it's not just East Asia that has succeeded. Western civilization has also succeeded very, very well over the last couple of centuries. Clearly, they have something to teach us. And even in this case, we are unlikely to be taught many of the ideas beyond the Harold Lasky to Amartya Sen lineage of thinking. Almost nobody in India is taught the ideas, for example, of Friedrich Hayek. He is one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. The reforms of Margaret Thatcher or Reagan, or in fact, in a second order sort of sense, the reforms we did since 1991 were all inspired by the thinking of Friedrich Hayek. And yet, it is possible to be a PhD in economics in India without ever having read a single line of Friedrich Hayek. The best you will get of a market economist is likely to be Adam Smith. And even there, not Adam Smith's own writings. You will be told about that he said something about the invisible hand. And immediately after that, you will be given a long list of things that are wrong about markets and about all the ways in which markets fail. And as I said, nothing about state failure. But in fact, Adam Smith was quite a sophisticated thinker. And even though he was writing in the 19th century, he was not a believer in laissez-faire free markets. He thought about many things, including, of course, the moral and ethical framework in which markets need to function. This is a very important thing, and I will come back to it just a little later. But there is a third framework of reference that we can also look at, and that is our own history. And why our own history? Because, as pointed out in the very latest economic survey, for more than 2/3 of known human history, India was the dominant economy in the world. In fact, Indian merchants were sailing out from right here in Gujarat out towards Oman and Bahrain and Mesopotamia back in Harappan times, i.e. in the Bronze Age. There's more than adequate evidence of large amounts of trade that was happening between the Middle East and India, but particularly Gujarat, going back 5,000 years back. And this tradition, of course, expanded over the centuries, so much so that by the Roman period, there was so much trade happening between India and the Roman Empire, and India was running such large current account surpluses with the Roman Empire that Pliny spoke in the Roman Senate complaining about the millions of gold and silver coins that were being lost to pay the Indians for all the products, whether it was fine textiles or metallurgical goods and spices and so on. And this was not only true westward, where, of course, Indians were trading with the Romans and the Arabs and the Persians, but also eastward. We were trading with Southeast Asia, we were trading with China, we were trading with Japan and Korea. In fact, Korean history starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. There are Chola-era temples in many places along the Chinese coast. Singapore, many of you may have visited it, has a name basically clearly derived from India, Singhapura, the Lion City. So much trade happened with Indonesia that after it became independent from colonial rule in the 1940s, this country named itself after India by calling itself Indonesia. Its currency is the rupiah. Its national emblem is the Garuda. All of them clearly derived from India. In fact, the largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India but in Cambodia, the Angkor Wat. And all of this is not forgotten even in India. There is enormous influences from Southeast Asia and the rest of the world in India. So for example, how many of you here, anybody here from Odisha here? Yeah, there is a gentleman, there are a couple of people here from Odisha. Well, one of the most important festivals in Odisha is a festival called Kartik Poornima, which happens in the middle of November. And you know why it is celebrated and how it is celebrated? Well, let me tell you. In early morning of Kartik Poornima, families, but women and young children, usually go off to a water body and put a small paper boat in the water with a small lamp in it. Do you know what they are doing? They are effectively commemorating the fact that in ancient times, this was the time when the winds changed from blowing from south to north to blowing from north to south, when the Odia sailors would set sail for Indonesia. And in fact, even today, a fair is held in Odisha, in Cuttack, called Bali Yatra, which literally means the journey to Bali. So there's enormous influence of that ancient time on our culture, on our civilization. And of course, then comes the question, if we were such a major economic power for such a long period of time, was this just about, a matter of organic evolution? Or was this based on institutions, on some sort of a intellectual underpinning? And I would argue it was. This was not just individual traders going off to trade. Far from it. What you had was much of this trade being carried out by corporatized guilds, international corporatized guilds, which were very much like multinational companies of today, involving hundreds of merchants with tripartite agreements between the producer guilds, the merchants, and the customers on the other side of the sea. And these were not incidentally financed by personal finance. They were financed by temple banks. The reason that many of these temples had a lot of gold was not that many of the kings were handing over their money to the temples. Indian politicians even then did not hand over money to anybody. The reason that the temples had such a lot of money was that they functioned as banks, and they were the venture capital that was backing all of this trade that was going on. The reason Somnath had such a large amount of money there was that it was a port, and the temple was the key to the financial system of that time. If you go to Somnath, you will see it is right on the beach. There is a very good reason for that. So anyway, if this was what that economic system was based on, what were its intellectual underpinnings? Again, almost nobody is taught anything about this. Not the economists and not even the historians. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the intellectual underpinnings of ancient Indian economics. And you will see very quickly that there is many interesting things to be learned from it. Now, there were not just one or two economists in ancient India. There were whole schools of them. So some of you may have heard of Kautilya's Arthashastra. That's very likely to be pretty much the limits of what you know about economists from ancient India. But in fact, there were major schools which predated Kautilya. And in fact, he mentions them in the Arthashastra. There was the school of Brihaspati. There was the school of Shukracharya. There was, of course, Kautilya's own school. There was the school of Manu. And many of these schools survived over long periods of time. For example, Kautilya was one of the founders, of course, of the Mauryan Empire, also known as Chanakya. But he had followers who were writing about his ideas and taking them forward 600 years later in the Gupta period. So you have writers in the Gupta period writing about economics, quoting Kautilya, who himself was quoting Shukra and Brihaspati. And then even in the Maratha period, there were writers who were carrying on this tradition. So it's a very long tradition. And in its tradition, the idea was that there were 4 broad areas of knowledge that were considered important for governance and economic management in ancient India. And these broad sort of areas of knowledge, which are mentioned in all of these texts, included these 4. First was the field of Varta. Varta meant economic policy making. So this was about wealth creation and how to go about it. The second was Dandaniti, or law, enforcement of contracts and things related to that. Then there was Anvikshiki, which was about philosophical framework and ethics and morals and trust systems. And finally, Trai, which was about cultural context or cultural roots. So these were the 4 broad areas of knowledge. Now, not everybody agreed about the relative importance of all of this. So for example, the Brihaspati school thought that economic policy and law, that is Varta and Dandniti, were the 2 most important areas of knowledge for running an economy. Shukra's school, on the other hand, Shukracharya's school, had a different view. They said that the most important area was Dandaniti, i.e. the imposition of law, enforcement of contracts, and everything else followed from that. Kautilya's school, on the other hand, said that all 4 schools were important. And Manu's said that Trai was really a part of Anvikshiki, and so really there were 3 areas of knowledge. So there were others as well. I am simplifying here for the purposes of this lecture. Now, since we are remaining in, I'm going to take this forward mostly using Kautilya's approach. Let's go through each one of them and see how they thought about this. Now, I'm going to start with Varta. Varta was about the science of wealth. And this was very important, not just with Kautilya, but with many, many economic thinkers of the past. So, although today, for some reason, we have come to think of wealth and wealth creation in somewhat apologetic terms, thanks to our few decades of socialist thinking, ancient India celebrated wealth creation. And this shows through not just in the writings of Kautilya, but also in other writers. For example, in the Thirukural, and we have quoted it in this time's economic survey, as some of you may know. So here is one of his quotes. Wealth, the lamp unfailing, speeds to every land, dispensing darkness at its Lord's command. Another quote from Thirukural. Make money, there is no weapon sharper than it to destroy the pride of your enemies. So, there is no apologia here for becoming rich. You can afterwards redistribute wealth through various policies, and many of these writings do talk about it. Even today, this government has put together many policies to help the bottom of the pyramid, including health, insurance, and many income support schemes. But as the Prime Minister repeatedly says, you can only redistribute wealth if you create wealth. Otherwise, all you're doing is redistributing poverty. So what did Kautilya have to say about creating wealth? Well, he was very clear that the basis of wealth was enterprise, commerce, and trade. And he tells us in the Arthashastra, the king, i.e. the state, shall promote trade by setting up trade routes by land and by water, and by establishing ports and market towns. Now this is very important because you see from the very beginning, India didn't only do maritime trade by sea. India was connected from at least the Iron Age by two major highways. One of them was the east-west highway, which we call the Uttarapath, which went from eastern Afghanistan, went all through the Gangetic plains, and went all the way to Bengal, the ports of Bengal. That was the east-west highway. It was called the Uttarapath. It exists today as National Highway 2. There was also a north-south highway called the Dakshinapath. And this went from the Gangetic plains down south to Ujjain, where it split into two. One side came to Gujarat. The other side went down south to Pratishthan, or what Paithan today, further south to Kishkinda, and all the way down to the southern tip of India. And these two highways crossed each other just outside Varanasi in a place called Sarnath. The reason that Gautam Buddha decided to give his first sermon in Sarnath was because the two most important highways crossed there. Remember, he got enlightenment in Bodh Gaya. That's quite some few hundred kilometers away. Why did he go to Sarnath? Well, if he wanted to spread a new idea, the best place to go was where the two most important highways crossed each other. So, from a very early period, we had this thing that the kings of that time invested in infrastructure. But they also invested in ease of doing business. And Kautilya writes, the trade route shall be kept free of harassment by courtiers, government officials, thieves, frontier guards, and damage by herds of stray cattle. Now, as a government servant, I'm rather concerned that Kautilya has put me along with thieves and stray cattle. But this matter of keeping business, making business easy, of ease of doing business, is something we take very, very seriously in this government. And as you know, in the last few years, our ranking in the ease of doing business has gone up very significantly. In the World Bank's doing business rankings in particular. If I remember correctly, we have gone up from something like 142 or something thereabouts to 63 in the very latest readings. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to do better. And there are many areas that we need to do better. So let me give you a few examples of that. Now, let's take the simple act of setting up a restaurant in a major Indian city. Now, if you tried to do this in Singapore, you would need 4 major permits or licenses from the government. If you get those 4, you can set up your restaurant in Singapore. Same is, by the way, in many other, similar number you'll get in most other countries in the world. But supposing you wanted to do this in India, then in Bengaluru, you would need 35 permits. In Delhi, you would need 26, and in Mumbai, 22. Now, if you think each one of them is just easy to get, let me tell you what happens with each one of them. Well, some of these permits are quite bizarre permits, so let me tell you the names. You will need separately a music permit. You need a special signage permit. And there is even a special permit for bicycle delivery. But one of the permits that you need, not in every city, but Delhi certainly you need it, is a Delhi police eating house permit. In order to get this permit, you have to give in 45 documents. In order to get a gun license, you need only 19. But of course, the services industry still has it easy. If you were attempting to actually export from India, this is the problem you would face. So in this economic survey again, the latest one, please read the chapter on ease of doing business. And you will see what we did is we did a bunch of case studies by trying to track what happened if you sent a consignment of some merchandise product and simply followed its route all the way to wherever it was being exported. So one of the studies we did was to take a consignment of ready-made garments and to follow it all the way to a warehouse in the US. So from the factory gate in Delhi, this consignment of ready-made garments set sail, and it goes by road, and it takes 5 days to reach Nhava Sheva port. That's in Mumbai. 5 days. Now, this should be easily done in any other country in 2 days at most, 2 maybe 3 days. And this is, remember, after we have got rid of all those state stops after this GST has been removed. So this is the improved situation. But this is the good news. Once it reaches Nhava Sheva port, it then takes up to 14 days to actually get onto a ship. I.e. the last 500 meters takes them 14 days. Why? Because of customs. Then you have to load and unload, then repack. All of this takes 14 days. And in fact, this whole thing is so uncertain with so much arbitrariness, rent seeking, etc. that happens along the way, that 4 days extra are being simply added by the exporter because he's unsure about the exact timing and he doesn't want to miss a ship. So as you can see, 19 days have been spent doing this. Then it takes about 20 days to reach America by ship and 3 days on the other side to reach the warehouse. So of the 41 days that we have taken to do this, it takes 19 days inside India. Now we decided, okay, let's do this in reverse. By the way, we did this with other products also, like sending carpets, exporting carpets from Mirzapur to US. Similar kinds of numbers. It took slightly less days. Instead of 19, it took 14, or I can't remember the exact number. But it took very large number of days to actually make it pass. So we decided, okay, let's do this in reverse. And we took a carpet from Italy and tried to see how much time it takes to come to a warehouse in Rajasthan. So in Italy, it took 24 hours from factory gate into the ship. Then it took 20 days to get to India by ship. Then it took 8 days to get off the ship and get to the warehouse. At one level, I'm happy. This only took 8 days. On the other hand, we discovered that our logistics is better for imports than for exports. So we decided we'll go and find out if this was the same in our airports. So we went to Bengaluru airport and we looked at some electronics exports that were being done from there. Particularly, we looked at our exporters who had been registered under a particular new scheme and tried to see how much time it took for an electronics exporter to send his products. He was exporting it by air through Bengaluru airport. And we found that it took 6 hours. So from factory gate till the aircraft took off, it took 6 hours. Same customs officials, same country, and this is after Bangalore's traffic. How did they do it? In other words, we Indians can do it because this, ladies and gentlemen, is the best there is in the world. This is better than what China does through Shenzhen and Hong Kong. So in other words, we can do ease of doing business and do it seriously when we put our minds to it. That is very, very important. And this is an issue, as I said, that all those years ago, Kautilya had thought about. Now next, move on to another issue that Kautilya had thought about, which was Danda Niti, rule of law, enforcement of contracts. In fact, while everybody may have disagreed on various other fields of knowledge, every single school of thought agreed that Danda Niti was a critical area of knowledge. Because without it, you could not avoid Matsya Nyaya. Matsya Nyaya is the situation where the big fish eat the small fish, i.e. a system of a rule of the jungle. And in Indic political and economic philosophy, avoidance of Matsya Nyaya is one of the most important things that whatever institutions, philosophy, policies, etc. are supposed to be there. This is the ultimate aim of Indian political philosophy, which is avoidance of Matsya Nyaya. So Danda Niti was a very important way of avoiding Matsya Nyaya in all schools. Now supposing we asked Kautilya to come to India and have a look at our legal system, I think he would be very, very, very disappointed. This is a country today where 35 million cases are stuck in our legal system. By the time I finish the speech, a few more hundred will have been added. And this is a very serious issue because in the ease of doing business rankings that we get, while we have improved dramatically on many other counts, we continue to be ranked 163 out of 190 countries on enforcement of contracts. Most of the countries that are ranked below us are essentially dysfunctional. So they are Somalia, Afghanistan, and so on. And just to show you how things are, a simple enforcement of contract in India requires, on average, 1,445 days. One of our peers, Indonesia, named after us, takes only 400 days. New Zealand does it in just over 200 days. So, without enforcement of contract, you cannot have a functioning market economy. And this is a very, very important reform that we need to do. And I would argue that this is now the single biggest hurdle to India's economic progress. So, this is an issue, again, I repeatedly have highlighted over the years in my own writings. The previous economic survey had a full chapter on it, and I talk about it again in this economic survey, and I can assure you I will speak about it again in the next one till we get going on it. This is a very important thing that we need to fix it for the 21st century. This is a basic thing. It does not matter what the technology we have, what the politics we have, how the rest of the world is going to be. We cannot be a developed, prosperous country without having a functional legal system. Let it be absolutely clear about this. Now let me come to Anvekshiki. Anvekshiki relates to the philosophical and ethical frameworks. Now, why would I care about this here in an economics lecture? The reason is that although wealth creation is an important objective, all our philosophies, while they extolled creation of wealth, they also meant ethical creation of wealth. This is important. If we are if we are creating wealth based on imposing costs, which social costs, ecological and environmental costs, or even economic costs on the rest of society, then this is not sustainable and it is not morally justifiable. Incidentally, this is not just a concern of Indian thinking. If you look at Western thinking as well, going back all the way to Adam Smith, people must know that he didn't merely talk about the invisible hands of markets. Most of his writings, ironically, were about moral philosophy. So, this is also true in the Indian tradition, that trust and trust systems are very, very important. And this is the reason that over the last 5 years, we have put in a lot of effort and occasionally imposed a significant amount of pain, perhaps, and disruption on the Indian economy by attempting to impose trust systems, by trying to improve business culture, by trying to clean up the banks and improve credit rights. Because if we do not have a financial system with clear credit rights, then you will end up having the massive misallocation of capital, all kinds of cronyism that ultimately will break down. So the point is that in 1991, we moved from crony socialism to crony capitalism. The last few years, what we have tried to do is to do something about the crony part of the thing, of the system. And yes, it has been disruptive, but I'm pleased to say that as a result of the various efforts made, particularly under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, by forcing borrowers, particularly very large borrowers, to repay the banks, we have significantly improved the credit culture and business culture of this country. This is a one-time investment that we have to make, no matter how disruptive it is. At the same time, let me say that this is not only about trust that the government has in business or the citizen, it is also about the trust that the citizen and the taxpayer has in the government. It works both ways. And this is the reason that in the latest budget speech, you may have heard about an effort on creating a charter of taxpayer rights. We are cognizant of the fact that there are lots of discussions and accusations about harassment by tax authorities, by rent seeking, and so on. We take these feedback very, very seriously. And so we will be bringing on board a taxpayer charter, which Finance Minister announced in a speech, which will protect taxpayer rights. Now, such rights do exist in a handful of countries. In the US, for example, there is a bill of taxpayer rights. The Canadians have a bill of taxpayer rights. The Australians have a taxpayer right charter. Please read them. We would love to have your feedback on both the rights themselves and what would be a good way to ensure that these rights are enforced. Because it is very, very important that the taxpayer and the citizen trust the tax administration. It has to be a two-way trust process and a partnership. Now this brings me to the last of the areas of knowledge that our traditional ways of thinking thought about, which was the area of Trai. Trai was about cultural roots or cultural context and the importance of it. Now this is interesting today because we live at a time of globalization. We live at a time of globalization, but also at a time when there has been a big pushback against the rootless globalization that we had seen over the last couple of decades. And it's not just happening in India, it's happening worldwide. Brexit is a very good example of what is happening as a result of this globalization without cultural context, without taking into account local, cultural, and historical links and context. Now, as a country, India has been at the forefront of globalization and global trade. As we mentioned, we were a dominant world economic power for thousands of years, and this was based in international trade. So very quickly and early on, we also realized that globalization was not sustainable unless we took into account local, cultural context and rootedness. And that is why Kautilya, while writing Arthashastra, mentions Trai as an important part of what a good administrator, good economist needs to think when he is thinking about prosperity and creation, wealth creation. And indeed, in some ways, what I am attempting to do through this lecture is doing precisely that. Is while you may be able to read about many of the ideas in various scattered places. I'm not hardly the first person who has come here and talked about the importance of markets, about maybe the importance of privatization or property rights or the importance of law. But what we are trying to do, and this we have consciously done through the very latest economic survey, if you have a look at it, you will see that what we have tried to do is make a case for a modern 21st century Indian economy based on principles that go back thousands of years. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to answer questions.
All right, we have about 10 minutes for the question answers. Just a couple of requests. Be very, very short and direct so that we can take more questions and allow him to speak more. And of course, to raise your hands before you speak. Thank you so much. I'll come to you, sir.
Wonderful speech. I just want to know about the global financial architecture, which is today heavily loaded in favor of people who are big, powerful, and are able to get away with many things. So global financial architecture has to be understood, and like what you said about the Arthashastra, which has to be, say, probably a part of the curriculum. In the same way, global financial architecture as it is existing should also be probed in great depth. Thank you.
Yes, you have raised an important issue. In fact, it's not entirely a new issue because I think this was an issue that popped up in the last global financial crisis in 2007 and 8, and it's been a persistent issue that pops up in multiple ways. And it pops up in, and there are many aspects to it. There's, of course, the aspect of taxation and the fact that many people are able to go around getting taxed in any country, and a matter that was recently even mentioned in the context of the latest budget. But there are other aspects to it beyond taxation. For example, how do you manage the world's financial architecture? And there are some very tricky issues involved here. It's not just about imposing more control. And so let me give you a flavor of this. See, one of the ways in which the global financial architecture is being currently sort of regulated, so to speak, is by introducing Basel III norms. Right? Now, Basel III norms are basically about forcing a certain kind of capitalization for all the banks around the world that have signed up to this. And India too has signed up to it. And at one level, this is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with having banks that are better capitalized. Who can argue against that? But Basel III is not just about asking for more capital. It expects this capital to be done in a very peculiar, prescriptive way, where a certain kind of risk weights are top-down prescribed. Now, you may say, why should we care about this? We need to care about this because, you see, we do not live in a world of risk. We live in a world of uncertainty. Now, what is the difference between them? You see, risk is a world where you have roughly quantifiable shocks that will come to your system. Now, yes, there are certain kinds of quantifiable risks that you can have, but we also live in a world of unknown unknowns, of black swans, of unintended consequences, of butterfly effects, of events like black swans like the coronavirus we are having now. These are uncertainties. They are completely unknown what their implications are. We do not have any probability of what they will happen. When you live in this kind of a world, then there is a real problem, because if you have a prescriptive risk management system and you have imposed it on every single bank in the world, then what you have done is essentially killed off all genetic diversity. Every single bank in the world is essentially managing its risk in exactly the same way. Now, if you live in a world of uncertainty, it's only a matter of time before you get hit by a shock which your way of managing risk had not accounted for. And when that day comes, not only will a few banks go under, all of them will go under. So, as a result of this, I have argued, and there are many, I'm just giving you one example of this, having excessively prescriptive regulations on systems sometimes can actually be counterproductive. So, whenever somebody says, we need to have regulate something, you need to be very, very careful that this does not, having better regulation is not necessarily more regulation. And to confuse these two actually makes the system far more brittle than it was if you had done nothing, perhaps. I hope you have answered your question. Thank you.
So in today's time, if we see consumer...
You'll have to be louder.
Oh, okay. Okay. So in today's time, so consumer spending is reducing significantly. So what do you think government should do to increase that? Because that's not good for the economy, I guess, in long run.
So one of the things is, we have to be very clear about something, that given our demographic profile, it is very, very likely that although consumption will grow, it is more likely that our savings rate will rise also fast. This is what is likely to happen, because this is what happened to almost every country that went through our cycle of growth. When we say, for example, that we want to have investment-driven growth, effectively what we are also saying is that we want a savings-driven growth. Because in every country, high investment-driven growth is ultimately backed by high savings rates, domestic savings rates. You can get some money from foreign money to get the system going, but ultimately it depends on domestic savings. But if you are asking for domestic savings to be the driver of growth, then you are effectively saying that your consumption, although it will grow, it will not be the driver of growth. That is a consequence, a corollary of demanding investment-driven growth. So if that is the model of growth you're going to go for, then we have to be very, very careful that we are not expending enormous energy trying to fuel an unsustainable consumption boom. Consumption should not be the driver of growth, it should be the result of growth. So what then should be the driver of growth? Then the driver of growth comes to be either exports or domestic investment. And a case was made in the previous economic survey, and again we are making it, that we have a preference for investment driving the growth. It could be domestic private investment, it could be government investment in infrastructure, it could be foreign investment coming in. That is our model of what growth should be driven by. Now, whether you think we are doing a good job of it or not is your call, but this is the model. Now, this does require several things. One is it requires ease of doing business, and we take it seriously. We cannot have the kinds of logistics I described a little bit earlier. We need to get our legal system and enforcement of contracts right. We need to have a simple tax system. And you may have seen major changes that we did in the corporate tax system, and now we have created dual road system for personal income tax as well. And hopefully over time we will move to a simplified single tax system with low rates of taxes for that. And of course, one very, very important ingredient into all of this is cheap capital. Every investment-driven growth model ultimately has to depend on the availability of a large amount of cheap capital. Now, how does one get that? One is, of course, getting FDI and all of that. But in the end, a large part of it has to be driven by domestic financial system. That must include the Indian banks. Now, we have spent now 4 or 5 years cleaning up a banking system that was essentially dysfunctional. We have introduced and imposed credit rights. It was important to do this. But now we have a banking system that needs to go out there and expand. And I don't mean expanding a little bit faster than in the economy. We need a banking system that is an order of magnitude larger than the one we have today. So we need our banks to lend again. If we have cleaned them up, we've recapitalized them, we now need to get on with it and lend. Those of you who have businesses will know our economy needs credit, and it needs it at lower interest rates. So this transmission of the monetary impulse through the economy is got to be the central theme of the next several quarters of economic policy making. You have begun to see that both in my talks. You'll see the finance minister talk about this, but of course the Reserve Bank governor also spoke about this. The transmission of the monetary credit impulse is absolutely critical. Then of course there are other parts of the financial system that also need to be developed. One of them is the corporate bond market. It's not just the banks that give money. There are other forms of money that are available in other economies. One of them happens to be the corporate debt market. In India, we don't have a functioning corporate debt market. What we have, to the extent it exists at all, is essentially, you can call it a securitized loan market. That's the best I can call it. So why is it that we don't have an evolved corporate debt market? The reason for that is that we do not have a corporate default swap market. So what is a corporate default swap market? Basically, you see, the nature of corporate debt is such that it is fundamentally, except for maybe for very large companies, it is by its very nature, even in the US, it's an illiquid market. The way you allow it to be liquid is by having something called a corporate default swap market. We don't have a corporate default swap market, but why don't we have one? Because we do not allow for something called bilateral netting. We force our financial institutions essentially to keep capital aside on a gross basis, when in fact they should be allowed to do this on a net basis. I.e., you're not allowed to net your positions against another financial institution. So very quickly, the amount of capital you're putting aside becomes so large that you cannot carry on doing this and you stop. So one of the major reforms, which sounds very technical, so almost no media picked it up, is the creation of a new law on bilateral netting. Please Google up what this is, but this law has already been kind of put together, and we hope to pass it through. It's already been announced in the budget speech, and hopefully we'll put it through the course of this year. But this is a major, major reform, and this will create the corporate default swap market and consequently a corporate bond market. Many of the students here, they are all commerce and students, so you're going to perhaps go ahead and work in the credit derivatives or credit bond markets in the future. When you do, please remember that you heard about it first here. Sorry, you'll have to speak in the mic. I can hear something. You speak in a mic. Okay. So let me actually disagree on this. While you're right that onion prices did briefly go up very sharply, but I'm told they have come back down. For most things, prices have actually been more and better anchored than ever before in Indian economic history, certainly since independence. We have had actually the longest period of stable inflation that we have ever had And this did not happen by chance. About 4 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, we introduced an inflation targeting framework where we targeted inflation between 2 to 6% with a midpoint of 4%. And we gave a monetary policy committee the right to set interest rates with very strict targets. This has been actually a very successful model in terms of bringing down inflation, which in India historically used to run in the 8 to 10% range, occasionally going up to 12%, to a range which has now been in and around 4%. In fact, the only time this inflation rate has gone outside of this 2 to 6% band has not been on the upside, like many people feared, but in fact been on the downside. We have touched 2% twice in the last few years, and this has been a big success in terms of anchoring inflation. Now, of course, doing this was actually painful. Much of the deflationary pressures that you have, many of you may have felt, especially if you're in business, happened because the adjustment from a high inflation country to a low inflation country is a disruptive, painful thing. Many of you will therefore have complained that, real estate prices began falling. Not a happy thing if you happen to have just bought a house and its price began falling. But if we want to become anchoring our prices somewhere, we had to break that momentum of inflation some point in time. And we have done it. You and I have done it. You have been a partner in this process. But painful as it may have been, it's done. We are now a low inflation country. And no matter the occasional bouncing around of onion prices, for which, by the way, I'll come to a little point, we need to do something about that, but separately. But overall inflation is actually better anchored than ever before. Now comes the problem with this instability or spikiness of certain commodities, particularly food, vegetables particularly, which may be the driver of your question. The recent episode with onion prices, or earlier there was one with tomato prices. Why does this happen? The way now these prices, note, are very difficult to control using monetary policy. I mean, interest rates have almost no impact on onion prices or tomato prices. So how do we normally try to control them? We try to control them using something called the Essential Commodities Act. The problem, and this is a point that again, if you read the economic survey, we have talked about it. The problem is that the Essential Commodity Act actually makes things even worse. Why? Because you see, the Essential Commodity Act was put in place in the 1950s when we were a country of scarcity, where markets didn't function and there were a lot of small isolated markets with price rigging and so on. So a country which had just come out of partition, just come out of the effects of war, that was thought to be at that time, perhaps that was a sensible thing to do. But today we actually produce more than enough vegetables, we produce more than enough onions or whatever it is. In fact, the farmers usually complain that their prices are not high enough. So why is it that we get these spikes? We get these spikes because we have a problem of storage. So then why aren't people going and storing more? They're not storing more because if anybody did invest in a storage business, when prices began to move up, we would call them hoarders and raid them under the Essential Commodities Act. And as a result of this, the Essential Commodities Act actually causes prices to spike up. Those items which are outside of the Essential Commodities Act actually have much more stable prices. After all, prices in Hong Kong and Singapore for onions are stable. They don't go up and down. They don't grow onions. Why don't they go up and down? Because markets work and they stabilize the prices. But in India it doesn't, because if anybody tried to actually make the markets work, the government machinery itself would actually intervene and raid them under this act and probably put them in jail or whatever and call them hoarders. Until we get out of this mindset of accusing the market and the storer as a hoarder, we are never going to see an investment into market institutions and investments in cold chains, which would actually stabilize these prices. So this is again goes back to the same mindset problem, the framework of thinking problem that I was talking about. We are in the wrong framework of thinking for what we call essential commodities. And as a result, we are continuously surprised by the fact that we are unable to stabilize the price. Meanwhile, things like, for example, t-shirts are not under an Essential Commodity Act, and nobody complains about the price of t-shirts going up and down too quickly.
Sir,
I'll take one more question because my throat is now beginning to hurt.
sir, a remarkable job has been done by Indian revenue system, and a lot of transparency and ease of filing taxation has happened. But I think the more need to be done about bringing the gap between the trust deficit, what is known as, and also the tax terrorism, which, and the third part is the bringing more and more people under the tax nets. So your views on that, sir?
Well, I just mentioned that, we have many systems have been put in place. We have much more data, for example, under GST that we can mine. We have many other ways in which we can bring more people into the tax net, and they have come into the tax net. But let it also be very clear that we are never going to have a healthy tax culture until the taxpayer trusts the tax administration. And in some ways, this is the place where we need to invest next. And this is the context also in which we are now thinking about bringing a charter of taxpayer rights. Let me also say that this charter of taxpayer rights will be in the statute. It's not something we'll just put it up in the website. It will be in the law and consequently enforceable. And we need to have a national debate about what those rights need to be. We can look at the international experience. And we can also look at the international experience about enforcement. Because these rights are only useful if a taxpayer can enforce these rights against a tax official who he thinks is harassing him. So this is an important national debate we need to have. And let me elicit all your support in trying to get a top-notch charter of taxpayer rights into the law books. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful, wonderful lecture. In the morning, I was complaining to him that it took a long, long time for us to give a date, but I think the wait was worth it, right? So let's have a loud round of applause. And I request our Honorable President, Anujbhai Mehta, to please come on the dais and give a small token of love as a memento to Shri Sanjeev Sanyal, our Speaker of the Day. Sir, please. All right, we'll just be ending in 1 minute as I request Anuj Bhai to propose a word of thanks. Sir, please.
Only 1 minute, he said. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Your analysis of the Indian economy and the economic history of our country, and then putting it in perspective and talking about the future. I think you have analyzed it all brilliantly well today. And having said so, I think we are in safe hands. So thank you for being here on behalf of HL College of Commerce, the Ahmedabad Education Society, and the HL Alumni Association, and all of us here. We thank you for taking time out, coming here, enlightening us. And let me tell you one thing. We had eminent personalities here before, over a period of many, many years now. And you are right there for us. So don't feel that it was not any lower than even we had before. So, and looking at you, we were just talking, ma'am and I were talking, a young person like you have so much of experience and so much of, I think it was amazing. Thank you very much for being here.